Okay, so I'm a practice-based PhD researcher. I'm based here in Bath School of Art and Design, and my practice and research focus is in creating a visual response to abandoned places, primarily through contemporary paintings, drawing, print and mark making. And I'm currently focusing my research on 3 places. So the first 2, which are photographed here on the left, are the estuaries of the rivers Tor and Torridge in North Devon, and in the middle, the Boucher-Vialet factory in Grenoble in France, which are both post-industrial sites. And the third on the right is Porlock Bay in North Somerset. It's one of the first sites in the UK to be left to flood in the UK. So it's part of a coastal management plan called the Managed Retreat. So it means that most of it will probably be underwater within 50 years. But today I'm going to focus on the first 2 and just a couple of works that I've made in response to them. In the summer of this year, I had the opportunity to go to the Boucher-Vialet site in France for a summer school residency. And it's a huge factory complex. It's built by Eiffel in the Saint-Laurent neighbourhood of Grenoble. And it was part of the city's hydropower industry in the late 19th century, and it became a key part of the armaments industry in World War I. And part of the complex has been developed with varying degrees of sensitivity over the last decade. And then pre-economic crisis, since the economic crisis happened, the full redevelopment hasn't happened, so it's ground to a halt. So it's in this kind of weird transient state. And the space photographed on the left has been taken over by the National Contemporary Art Centre, and so it's called Le Magasin, and it's the largest remaining factory on the site. It's huge. It probably runs from about here to the car park as you enter into Sion Hill. And it was the smallest of the factories on the site, so the others have been demolished or segmented up. So the scale is almost sort of unimaginable. So I was part of a group of 40 cross-discipline PhD researchers and who came internationally, and we had the chance to map lost gestures in the place. So working collaboratively and performatively over the course of the week, we were in groups, and it was organised by La Maison de Création and Grenoble University. It was stifling when I was there. It was 38 degrees outside. It's a glass roof building, so there's no circulation. It must have been way over 40 inside. And I just found it staggering to think that this was how people worked. This was the conditions that people must have worked, like 12-plus-hour shifts, welding, heavy metals. And this was their life, and we were just kind of experiencing this. And all through the building, you walk over these spills and stains on the broken floor, and there are these amazing sort of remnants of past activities in the place where machines sat and people stood. And I was really fascinated by these remnants, and I wanted to make some kind of a response to my embodied experience of this place and my research about it. So I spent much of the week tracing and photographing the spills on the factory floor. I was thinking about Ingrid Calamet's work, tracing the LA River and post-industrial sites along Buffalo. But I also wanted to capture a sense of the ever-changing use of the site and its ongoing possibilities in the future, as well as a small fragment of my time spent there in conversation with the space. And interestingly, we were lucky enough to have Brian Masumi and Erin Manning come and visit. So we had a lot of conversations running through the text Deleuze en Foucault about the diagram and the gestural echo. So I kind of wanted to have some sense of that in my response. Grenoble's completely surrounded by the Alps, so that from all parts of the city you can see the snow-covered peaks year-round. And the River Drac follows directly to the west of the factory complex, which is highlighted in red. The meltwater from the mountains used to swell the river in summertime, regularly flooding across the low-lying land pre-industrial settlement. So prior to this latest stage of redevelopment, the site was derelict for many years before being reclaimed by a squat known by the local artist. And it was in a site called the Brise Glace, which translates as the icebreaker because of its shape that resembles an ocean liner. So I started to think about ice and look at ways to incorporate meltwater and echo the spills staining the factory floor in my response. And along the site, there are these huge stone pillars, which kind of act almost as sentinels. And I kind of thought about these sentinels as watching over the actions of the artists in the site now, but also all of the actions of the people who'd worked in the factory before. So I made a performance kind of marking these sentinels. And I started to walk the length of the building holding an ice tray filled with frozen water and black ink set within it. And at each pillar, I took out an ice cube and I marked the pillar with an inky thumbprint, and then I left a single ice cube to melt at the foot of the pillar. So that over the course of the walk, each pillar was marked with my thumbprint and the shape of the ink spill that generated through the melted ice. It was so hot under the most sun-soaked pillars that the ice cubes evaporated within seconds, leaving a trace of their shape with a denser ink patch, while others continued to melt more gradually over minutes after the walk through the space had finished, leaving the ink to flow across a greater surface area, leaving its own unique mark of meltwater pattern. So during the course of the performance, I thought of my body as a tool to record and to try and reflect back small details linked to the place. And it was a way to leave new marks in conversation with the old marks left by the people who'd been there before me. So I'm just going to quickly run through the second work. So the second work I wanted to talk about is in response to my walks along the River Torridge at the point where it meets the River Tor in Instow in North Devon. And it's a site with many visible traces of its industrial past. So it has rusted hulls of ships along the river, which are now marooned as the banks and the rivers silted up, so the ships are no longer able to leave. And they once shipped coal to a partially dismantled power station now. They exported bull clay, pottery, and black pigment. My grandmother, who's just turned 100, has lived most of her life in her 1950s bungalow overlooking the river. And so the place holds childhood memories for me and stories linked to it, and the stories are increasingly shrouded and unreliable through the fog of her dementia. So my walks here are trying to unpick and investigate stories about this place and clues that hint at past activity and the ongoing process of decay and entropy that surround it. So I re-began a series of walks here since my childhood earlier last year, and I was retracing old footsteps and taking new routes and making new discoveries. My experience of a place is always rooted in the contact with my feet in the ground, so I'm always kind of obsessed with the textural qualities of a walk and a place. My footsteps are marking out time and measuring my body against the ground and the feelings of textures underfoot. So in order to record aspects of the textures, I came up with a very basic kind of Heath Robinson contraption, which was using bits of gardening wire. I attached thin aluminium metal plates to the base of my boots, so that as I walk, the texture of the ground scratches into the plates and creates drawings into the metal, so they hold some trace elements of the texture. The area that I'm walking was an exporter of a black pigment that was used mainly in makeup, and it was called Bideford Black. And so as I walk, I collect small bits of this earthy pigment, which I then dry and I mix with printing oil. So that back in the studio, I use these as metal plates, which are basically etched into through the scratching of the surface and the forwards motion of my walk. So I use these plates to print with, and I use the pigment that I've collected on the walk as the printing ink. So that over time, as I make more and more walks, this becomes a greater and greater grid, and this kind of recording of all of the many walks kind of collapsed over time. Simultaneously, while I'm recording the texture of the ground using the metal plates, I capture another element of the kind of many snapshots which you talked about, Jeremy, while I'm walking. So this kind of sense that we don't have a single view of a place, but we have many, many kind of fragmented views. And again, going back to the idea of the map, I make the work directly onto the map, kind of playing around with the idea of how reliable and objective a map is of a place. So I'm kind of trying to make an alternative map of my experience of walking there. So I make lots of small ink drawings, just simple line drawings, as I walk onto the map into each segment. And they're just small kind of snapshots of views that capture my eye as I walk. And I annotate them with kind of things that I overhear or conversations that I have or things that kind of lodge into my mind, things like the tide and the weather. And these views make layer upon layer in my mind, so they kind of act like a multi-layered library of this place that I bring with me each time I walk. So I kind of want to get a sense of that into the maps. So that as I complete the whole map, I then put a very thin layer of watered gesso, and then I start again, and the original drawings become partially submerged. So I'm interested in what Julie Moretti calls the ghost image. So all of these walks I also record on a GPS app on my phone whilst I'm walking. And when I return to the studio, I make a final layer on top of the map, which is sometimes just one single line, and sometimes many, depending on how many walks have made each map. And they're kind of the culmination of these kind of shapes that I'm making with my body that I'm not necessarily that aware of until I look back. So just to finish, in thinking about my practice in the context of conversations I've had with Anthony about elastic spaces, and also drawing as performance. I was reading Tim Ingold's book about lines, and his writing about the trace as any enduring mark left in or on a solid surface by continuous movement. And I've started to think about my walks and the work made during these walks as both a way to create what Ingold calls additive but also reductive traces in a landscape or a place simultaneously. So the metal plates capture this reductive trace, so his definition is lines that are scratched into a surface, which is also part of my trace left behind with footprints, leaving reductive lines in the wet sand and the soft mud. But the shape of the traces left behind by my body in a space, like the form of the meltwater and the ink on the pillars in the disused factory site, leave this additive trace that layers and has kind of conversations with other additive traces and spills and marks that are left behind before me. And so I feel that the additive and reductive form a kind of conversation with the place, and they measure different aspects of the surface and the texture, but they leave behind possible future conversations and future recordings for other embodied experiments.